The Tel Aviv University scholar looks at what's ahead after Israel's withdrawal of Gaza settlers, who face an August 15th deadline. The Middle East Institute in Washington hosted this one-hour forum.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Clayton Swisher, Director of Programs, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Middle East Institute, America's oldest nonprofit, which has served since its founding in 1946 as an important conduit for information and dialogue between Middle Eastern nations, policymakers, organizations, and most importantly, the American public. First, some housekeeping issues. Out of courtesy to our speaker, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence any cell phones. Having been a student of Dr. Klieman's, I can attest that it might send him high and right. Second, I'd like to thank those of you in the audience who are MEI members for your continued support for our organization. And for those of you becoming newly acquainted with us, I'd like to encourage you all to join. In addition to gaining access to events such as these, MEI members receive discounted tuition through our language department, which offers Hebrew, Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish. In addition to usage of our extensive library, subscription to our scholarly publication, the MEI Journal, and the monthly MEI Bulletin, which keeps members current on all major issues within our mandate. Members are also invited to attend our annual conference, and on that note, I'd like to encourage everyone to mark their calendars for our 59th annual conference, which will be held at the National Press Club this coming November 7th through 9th. We're going to have a terrific lineup, and a formal itinerary is forthcoming next month. For those of you in Washington not vacationing or escaping the heat on Monday, this coming Monday, I'd like to also invite you to attend a special event we're having on Saudi Arabia after King Fahd, featuring our very own adjunct scholar and expert on Saudi Arabia, Thomas Littman. It is our privilege today to welcome Professor Ahron Klieman of Tel Aviv University, and as I alluded to, it is a personal honor for me as one of the many students he influenced. In an introductory course he taught on the Arab-Israeli conflict, I'll never forget the cautionary note he issued to those of us students new to the topic. He said that the Arab-Israeli conflict has a polarizing quality, that it is often discussed in such an emotional way that it will either cause you to run for your life or immerse yourself deeper into understanding. Dr. Klieman is one of the few scholars, in my opinion, who is able to bridge the many differences of opinion by providing analysis that rise above the day-to-day political, cultural, and religious fray. All of us are here today, for one reason or another, hooked by the human tragedies taking place in the Holy Land and concerned by the global repercussions it bears. We are all here in some way or another to better understand the momentous turn of events expected in the next week and a half as the government of Israel, under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, moves to end the occupation of the Gaza Strip by removing its military and settler presence both in the Gaza Strip and in portions of the northern West Bank. To understand the Israeli perspective and the impact this has brought upon the people of Israel and its political leadership, we are fortunate to have Dr. Klieman with us. Dr. Klieman has been a member of the Political Science Department at Tel Aviv University since 1969, is teaching this summer at Georgetown University, and will be visiting professor at UCLA in academic year 2005-2006. He holds the Nahum Goldman Chair in Diplomacy at Tel Aviv University and is also director of the Abba Eban Graduate Program in Diplomatic Studies. He is author of several books on Arab-Israeli peace, negotiations, and security, including Compromising Palestine. His most recent publication is Israeli Negotiating Culture, and Tamara Kaufman-Witt's How Israelis and Palestinians Negotiate. It's a fascinating look at the security subculture within Israel, and I encourage you all to read it. Dr. Klieman is also working on a book entitled The First Missed Opportunity in Middle East Peacemaking, the 1937 Initiative at Partitioning Palestine. And when you finish writing, Dr. Klieman, I hope you'll join us and allow us to present that book. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Klieman.
If I may be permitted a very brief personal note, I have a sense that this is a generational thing for me. Having done my MA work with Professor J.C. Hurwitz at Columbia University, and my PhD under Professor Majid Khadouri, just nearby at SAIS, it is especially gratifying to be here at the Middle East Institute. And for the invitation and the opportunity, I also want to thank Clayton, and who was generous enough to emphasize he had been a student of mine. So it's, for me, this is like a linking between three generations around the Middle East Institute. However, I don't intend to dwell nostalgically on the past. Only 2 weeks from the August 17th Gaza disengagement, I want to focus, together with you, on the present and longer-term prospects. Because of the limited time at our disposal, and I ask your forgiveness in advance, I'm going to present a number of thoughts for discussion in a rather cursory outline form, using as my central theme continuity and contiguity. In any discussion of the Arab-Israel conflict, I, for one, as a researcher, am always conscious of what might be termed Middle East word politics. Words have meaning. And I think a case in point is the term disengagement. Disengagement by who? From whom? From what? As I see it, this disengagement and the repercussions are taking place and will take place at three different levels. Israel's disengagement from Gaza, Israelis allegedly from Palestinians, question mark, the Gaza Strip from the West Bank, question mark. That's the contiguity in my title of Continuity and Contiguity. If you view it this way, disengagement is something of a misnomer. It's more in the nature of wishful thinking. Yes, it's Israel's initiative, but it cannot be done, in my opinion, unilaterally. Disengagement from Gaza, yes, although not, in any sense, an Israeli-Palestinian separation. And I recall former Prime Minister Ehud Barak's campaign slogan, Anachnu po, hem sham. We will be here, they will be there. As though there is a clean surgical dividing line that can separate or, quote-unquote, disengage our two peoples. Rather, I think necessity in our part of the world requires something that I termed in my work on compromising Palestine in the year 2000, soft partition or partition plus. It cannot be hermetic separation between the two communities, the two peoples. We are destined to live together in close proximity, side by side. And then thirdly, the misnomer. After more than a decade of constructive ambiguity and being left on the back burner, so to speak, the disengagement from Gaza is now bringing into sharp relief, really for the first time since the 1993 Oslo Declaration of Principles, it's bringing into sharp relief the issue of safe passage, which I did address in the 2000 study. In truth, this question of contiguity, or in Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's recent terminology, connectivity, the relationship between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as well as between a Palestinian state and the Jewish state, is anything but a secondary or technical peace agenda item. It goes to the very core of the future relationship. Which brings me, the center of my remarks, to Prime Minister Sharon's disengagement strategy. I lay no pretense to having any particular insight into his thinking, so what follows is one researcher's interpretation, and that's what I was asked to present, an Israeli perspective on the Sharon disengagement. As I see it, the outcome of the current move will depend, really, on a combination of factors. A, the Sharon vision, his concept of where this takes Israel and the Palestinians. This, Sharon's vision, in contrast to the Bush vision of 24 June 2002. The second determinant is Israeli domestic politics. The anti-disengagement movement, and whether in Israel, too, like in so much of Middle Eastern politics, it will be the extremists that lead or the pragmatists. So the Israeli domestic politics cannot be minimized or overlooked. And then the third, which completes the three determinants, the Palestinian reaction just prior to and immediately following August 17th, and the extent to which there will or will not be Israeli-Palestinian coordination. Here, let me offer a brief, but I'd like to hope conceptually useful note engaging the first and second factors, Sharon and Israeli politics. In some ways, it's like a pattern in American presidential politics, the transition from one president, one administration to another. There is a certain pattern, blending continuity in American foreign policy with distancing the incoming president's determination to be his own man and to distance himself from the previous administration, particularly if it is a switch from Democratic to Republican or vice versa. Continuity and distancing. I want to attempt, for the first time at least with you, to apply this to the case of Israel as an international and regional state actor. If we would only compare former prime ministers Yitzhak Shamir, Yitzhak Rabin, Binyamin Bibi Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, and the incumbent Ariel Sharon. There are certain signposts of continuity, like links in the chain. Among them, let me just mention 4 or 5 similarities between these prime ministers and governments. The first, reservations about true Palestinian Arab intentions. Second, the primacy of national security. Israel's perceived security dilemmas, now and over the horizon. Third, for all of them, the importance of American United States understanding and support. Fourth, the principle of compromise in any final status settlement. The principle of compromise, including that of territorial compromise. And fifth and finally, the continuity of a growing awareness over the years of the Gaza Strip as being distinctive and different, as being untenable from Israel's position, as being a drain on Israel. So much for the continuities. More important are the dissimilarities. Each prime minister has differed procedurally on how to go about in best protecting, preserving, and promoting Israel's core interests. And rather than take us through a comparison of 4 or 5 prime ministers, let me restrict myself very quickly to a comparison between former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Sharon. This sense of, along with the continuity, the distancing, taking deep issue from the predecessor. For Ehud Barak, the aim was end of conflict. Camp David 2000. For Sharon, as I read him, it is gradualism, incrementalism, the Kissinger approach of disengaging by phases with utmost caution, rather than throwing caution to the wind in a go-for-broke summit package. The second contrast, symmetry. For Barak, go right to the top, cut a deal. I, together with Arafat. Not for Sharon. In Sharon's view, because of the distrust, do what's good for Israel, even to the point of taking an initiative and conducting it unilaterally. Third point of contrast, for Barak, there was a readiness, in order to achieve end of conflict, to accept maximum withdrawal, somewhere in the range, and I know this is contentious, there are various maps, 2000 Camp David, but give or take 95, 97% withdrawal from the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, plus the principle of swaps, exchanges of territory. For Sharon, there's a determination for Israel's interest to retain a direct presence on the West Bank. And then fourth contrast, and with that I'll rest my case, Sharon, Barak viewed the safe passage issue, the question of the connection between the two wings, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as merely technical, tactical, to be worked out. I think Sharon is operating from a concept of the safe passage as really being strategic. As how did I put it earlier? Not technical by any means, or a secondary issue. And continuing this, I would say that in Sharon's calculus, there are other considerations entering in, and here I'll just touch upon them. The aim in the disengagement initiative, among others, is to improve Israel's international image of being a risk taker, not accepting the status quo, and of being forthcoming, followed by the importance of an endorsement and backing of the United States, especially as articulated in the exchange of letters, but President Bush's letter of 14 April 2004, showing understanding for Israel's considerations and needs. Building on those, the improved international image and American endorsement, once withdrawn from Gaza, behind an international line, in the event of acts of violence, mortars from Gaza into Israeli sovereign territory, then under the principle, the UN Charter and the international law principle, Israel's right to self-defense, that Israel would be in a stronger position rather than being in the very midst of the towns, camps, streets, byways of the Gaza Strip. It is Sharon's calculation that turning Gaza over to the Palestinians, with or without full coordination, that the Gaza Strip will preoccupy Chairman Abu Mazen, the Palestinian administration, and the Palestinians, as well as the international community. Gaza is desperately in need of all kinds of assistance reconstruction. Therefore, Gaza will be the test case for Palestinian intentions and ability to govern themselves. I add this parenthetically as someone who was deeply interested in seeing a return to the negotiating process. If the Palestinians cling to this as a victory, rather than viewing it soberly as a profound challenge, that will be one thing, one answer to the test. And if rockets continue to rain in on Sderot and other Israeli towns, that too will sway the Israeli domestic opinion up to the very minute of 17th August as well as beyond, putting into serious doubt whether withdrawal from Gaza does indeed enhance Israel's security and the security of Israelis. As part of the test, it will be then Israel's position to insist upon the Palestinians fulfilling the Bush vision and the roadmap conditions. The Palestinian obligations, I think we all know them: dismantling terrorism, ending inflammatory verbal attacks against Israel, handling its own security, institutional reforms, and the like. Now, one of two scenarios. If Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority fail, then the peace process will be arrested, will not go forward. Israel will have extricated itself from the Gaza Strip, as well as decouple, in potential, decouple the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. Sharon looking at it in strategic, geographical, territorial terms. In which case, not only will the peace process be arrested, but also, if Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority fail, then the peace process will be arrested, will not go forward. Israel will have extricated itself from the Gaza Strip, as well as decouple, in potential, geographical, territorial terms. In which case, not only will the peace process be arrested, but also, the evolution into Palestinian self-government and sovereignty, because then there could emerge a situation of Gaza as Palestine, being comparable to the Palestinian state, with Israel concentrating on Judea and Samaria and deepening that presence. However, second scenario, if the Palestinians fulfill their part of the preconditions and the roadmap, if they are capable of governing the Gaza Strip, then proceed with the roadmap, which could result, depending upon the negotiations, in a bifurcated state. It sounds like a highfalutin term, bifurcated state in which the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, I don't know anything else about the potential Palestinian state, its economy, society, government, etc. One thing I can tell you is that it will be a bifurcated state. It will be divided into two separate, remote, in Middle East terms, some 35, 40 kilometers between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and therefore the question of the link, and that will be dependent upon Israel's consent and cooperation. That is the whole safe passage road issue. And if a bifurcated state, reopening, as remote as it may seem to those of you in the audience, reopening, if the Palestinians are restricted to the Gaza Strip, reopening what we used to know in the 70s and 80s as the Jordanian option, some enhanced role for Jordan and King Abdullah II on the West Bank. Just a few moments about Israel's domestic front. I was asked to relate to that as well, which is virtually an entire separate issue, but 1 or 2 points. I don't think there can as of the 4th of August, there can any longer be any doubt as to Sharon's commitment to the disengagement plan. There was much speculation in recent months, whether this is just a ploy, whether this has Sharon really done a 180-degree switch, the settlements, etc. Nor is there any question about his determination and resolve. But it doesn't depend upon Sharon alone, as crafty and as politically astute as he may be. He is not a free agent, and he is incurring risks on 2 fronts, at home with the Israeli public and vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority. Because if this is to work and introduce an entire new balance of forces, a new situation, a period of mutual testing, then much will depend upon the Palestinian Authority. With regard to the anti-disengagement camp in Israel, like any camp, it really is very diverse and comprised of a number of different groups. I'll subdivide them, for the sake of simplicity, into 2. Whatever else, do not disparage the genuine anguish among anti-disengagement protesters. In a very real, meaningful, profound sense, we are witnessing the struggle for Israel's soul. That's a paraphrase on Fuad Ajami's famous article, The Struggle for Egypt's Soul, a number of years ago. Well, I think this is a wrenching experience. The clash between the normative, what many Israelis would like to see and have, and the realities. Between ideology and realpolitik. These opponents divide into, as I said, 2 subgroups. The first, those of a religious persuasion, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. They view this in ideological, theological terms, centering around the concept of the sanctity of the land of Israel. These are true believers. But as true believers, they may have the power of conviction. But in my humble opinion, they lack the political savvy, the sophistication, the ability to see nuance, gray areas, to view options somewhere in between, retaining all or retaining nothing. And therefore they cannot fathom Ariel Sharon's pragmatism. The mix of calculations as I've tried to present them to you. The second component of this anti-disengagement camp are the pragmatists. They are able to distinguish, even in terms of levels of sanctity in Judaism, between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of Judea and Samaria. And therefore, they are prepared to prioritize, to say not everything, but to focus that we too, Jews and Israelis, do have a claim to this contested area. However, their criticism of Sharon is that as of today, the present, they fail to see how disengaging from Gaza will enhance Israel's security. Here, in concluding at least my prepared remarks, it seems to me that in the short space of this half hour, we come full circle. Having begun as a unilateral project on Israel's part, in the immediate sense, the success or failure of disengagement has now come to depend on that third variable. Depends no less on the Palestinian response. And ironically, from Sharon's anti-Oslo, anti-Barak, anti-Rabin stance, and the 2004 announcement of Israel's intention unilaterally to take the initiative and to withdraw, the irony is that it only now reconfirms disengagement from Gaza, reconfirms how we, the two directly concerned parties, Israelis and Palestinians, continue to be and really are interdependent. Thank you very much.
We're going to now take some questions, but I'd first like to pose the first one, if I might. I was recently in the Gaza Strip this summer, and I could tell that the sense among many Palestinians there was that before the disengagement takes place, if there's any provocations across the border, that the Sharon government intends to go in with a massive military hand and sort of teach the Palestinians a lesson, if you will, that this should not be looked upon as a victory, as sort of Hezbollah did after the withdrawal from Lebanon. I'm wondering if you think the settler minority, the anti-disengagement camp, the ones wearing orange, if we could expect in the next coming weeks them to sort of try and provoke this sort of confrontation by firing on Palestinians, or in another way, can we expect this disengagement camp to fire on fellow Israelis?
Well, as all of us who live or study the Middle East know, you must always leave room for the unanticipated, for the unexpected, for the uncontrolled. Why wait until after August 17th? There have been many voices urging Sharon to respond already now. Perhaps one last show demonstration of force and go in and clean it out. For whatever reasons, he has resisted yielding to that kind of public pressure. Clearly, Israel would prefer not to. What happens after August 17th is, how did I put it? It's a whole new game. It will depend on both. I don't carry a brief for the government of Israel. I just know that a great deal of resources, energies are being expended to try to prevent that kind of situation where, yes, we too have our extremists, our crazies, irrational, one last desperate effort, one personal gesture, but to do everything possible to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's a cat and mouse game, as you're reading and seeing on television, I'm sure, in trying to close off the Gaza Strip and prevent the anti-disengagement activists from penetrating and making a last stand on the Gaza Strip. It's going to be a very heated summer for all of us, whether here in Washington or along the Gaza Strip demarcation line.
And your questions. Michael Dunn, please.
Yes, Michael. Just an opportunity to acknowledge we...
Thank you. Ahron, putting on your hat as a diplomatic historian for a moment here, can you comment a little bit about the Egyptian role and the role as envisioned by Israel for Egypt here? Because we're seeing Egyptian border troops coming back to the Israeli and Palestinian borders for the first time since the demilitarization of Sinai, and this has received almost no attention in this country. I know it's received a bit more in Israel, but I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yes, to be sure. I would like to link it to one of the points I made, and that is the continuities among Israeli governments and leaders, and that is the insecurity dilemma. Israel lives with these insecurities and the uncertainties for all its military prowess and capabilities, etc. And that is, just view it in terms of the 1979 treaty. What Israel has been negotiating, discussing with counterparts in Cairo is inviting the Egyptians to basically resume a military presence and positions in contravention of the 1979 treaty. And there have been voices, including really responsible people. Dave Kimche, the former Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These are not ideologists. These are people who are concerned. What are we doing? Are we opening a Pandora's box? How do we really know after Mubarak? How do we know whether Egypt really will continue to abide by the letter and spirit of the treaty? Not a hot peace, but a cold peace. And that the Egyptians will play fair game with us in the sense of their interest too lies in maintaining security along these border crossings. Philadelphia passage from the Gaza Strip into Egypt, preventing smuggling, guns, drugs, etc. So that here you have a triangulation of interests, basically. And so between the Palestinians, the Egyptians, and the Israelis. Because this too, from an Egyptian standpoint, could become awkward in friction between the Palestinian Authority and the Egyptians if they do clamp down and really maintain tight control. So Israel feels that it is taking a chance, a risk here. It is one of the least remarked upon demonstrations of Israel's commitment, that this is really genuine. To invite Egyptian presence, which can always be enhanced, enlarged, as part of the disengagement. Here is an opportunity for all of us to demonstrate a modicum of goodwill. I know it's the Middle East and it's the Arab-Israel conflict. That's a commodity which we're very short of. But that the Egyptians do have a positive role to play, if they will perceive of it as such, then it will be a, excuse me, a positive contributing factor.
Take a question from MBI Vice President Ambassador Mack.
I'm David Mack from the Middle East Institute. To what extent is Ariel Sharon's strategy based on his growing realization that if Jews are not already a minority between the Mediterranean and the Jordanian River, they will become so in a very short period of time?
I haven't followed that particular point. He's expressed himself on a number of occasions in vague terms, saying that he doesn't really abide by that thesis, that he's not afraid of the demography. But by anybody's count, disengaging from 1.3, 1.4 million Palestinians cramped together in the Gaza Strip, and thereby changes the population equation. If you only then restrict it to Israel proper and the West Bank. That in terms of the Palestinian Arab population, that putting them in a separate category, a separate entity, affects the demographic balance. Again, there's the imponderables. There are those who hold out the pious hope that the Jewish population will increase, influx of immigration, France, elsewhere, but only dealing with what we do know and not what is speculative. I think that he doesn't abide by that, press the panic button. Because then, the ultimate logic of that argument is that at no point will a Jewish state in any circumscribed bit of territory be able to maintain itself. If you view it demographically, Israel anywhere with 6-point-something million people, as opposed to the Arab peoples surrounding, in any territorial redivision.
Sorry. Thanks. Two questions. First, if you could just sort of give an overall, in the history of Israel's history, where this disengagement, how this compares to the Six-Day War and all the major, events. I mean, sort of how, give a perspective. It's not just for the religious right that it's a major deal, but sort of how Israel sees itself in its place. And second of all, I don't think you mentioned or talked too much about what was you mentioned the connectivity between the West Bank and Gaza, but you didn't mention too much about the wall in the West Bank and E1 and some of the major settlement blocks and what comes next after the day after when attention will refocus, I think, on the West Bank.
With regard to the first, sort of a survey history of Israel's relations with the Gaza Strip.
I'm asking you to sort of sum it up, how momentous this is for Israel. You don't really follow this on every day.
All right, I'm not going to take it all the way back to 1947, 1949, Gaza. I began by emphasizing word politics, that we really should be more sensitive to terminology and without making mountains out of molehills, but words do convey certain ideas. I, for one, and I say this, not patting on the back, but I'm in writing on it as well, I've never been captivated by the mischievous conjunction and. Gaza Strip, the West Bank and Gaza. As I say it, does that not evoke for you the idea? Like, Gaza is just a postscript. It's a PS. It's just an appendage and extension. As though they're inherently linked. By what? By societally, in terms of the Arab... they've had separate histories between 1948 and 1967. In terms of the societies, they're different. They have different ruling, contending, rival power structures between Gaza and the West Bank. They're different topographically, climatically. I've never really been swayed by this lumping them together. The West Bank and Gaza. I think it's an denigrating to the Gazan population with its particular needs, etc. It needs to be discussed on its own. So first of all, I've never perceived them as being one lump sum, but always distinctive. And so therefore, for me personally, it's much easier to see the natural justice and the wisdom of Sharon saying, disengage from Gaza, and then we'll need to deal, whether according to the roadmap, or unilaterally, or with the Palestinians bilaterally, with the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. Secondly, little-known secret, Israeli leaders, and I'm glad that I took you through the paces by recalling, as going back as far as Shamir and even Begin, at the time of the Sadat Initiative. Israel had attempted on several occasions, formally and informally, through feelers and what would happen if, to try and entice Egypt into reclaiming responsibility for the Gaza Strip. And the Egyptians, wisely from their standpoint, said, thanks, but no thanks. They would not do it. And Israel tried it again in Oslo with Arafat suggesting, first we'll withdraw from Gaza and demonstrate. Again, it's deja vu. Then you will have an opportunity to demonstrate your administrative skills, state building, nation building, and then we'll go on. Phase two to the contested West Bank. And Arafat, of course, dismissed that categorically. And as a result, if you recall, 1994, 1995, the formula that was worked out is Gaza and Jericho first. So, meaning that, in contrary to those Israelis to say that giving up the Gaza Strip is a great sacrifice on Israel's part, all right? I happen to subscribe to the second group, which says that we are relieved of Gaza, and it becomes a Palestinian/international issue. And Israel does have responsibilities and acknowledges it in terms of the opening to the sea, the airport, question of one road, more roads, to the safe passage linking Gaza commercially to the West Bank. But in many ways, it will be to Israel's advantage, whatever happens, security-wise and otherwise, to be out of Gaza. And I, for one, was said it should have been done many years ago, but we cannot cry over spilt milk. We can cry over the spilt blood.
Mark Matthews with the Baltimore Sun. I'd like to ask about the accompanying withdrawal from the 4 settlements in the northern West Bank. Americans had expected that part of the withdrawal would be accompanied by a fairly significant military withdrawal because Israel would no longer need to protect settlements up there. Now we learn that military withdrawal may not happen. As an expert on Israeli negotiating strategy, do you think it will happen anytime soon? And
what will happen? Pardon, excuse me for asking you.
The military withdrawal from the area of the 4 settlements in the northern West Bank, and what assurances does Israel need for that to take place?
I don't think Israel is asking any assurances from anybody. That too is on the calendar in terms of the withdrawal. But this is in connection, and I apologize because I really didn't address your second question, but let me try to link it, and that is about the security fence barrier. That withdrawing from those 4 settlements still exposes Israel to the west of those 4 settlements, Israelis to the south of it. So from the very beginning, it was patently clear that there would continue to be a security problem there, and that indeed is one of the purposes of this security barrier. So may I piggyback on that and say, people, really in any discussion, it is so important not only to be sophisticated about the nuances behind words, but also the map. And the map, what should have been apparent to any observer of the peace process back in 1993, Gaza and Jericho, Gaza and the West Bank, areas A, B, and C, all well and good, but any high school student looking at your basic outline map of the Middle East ought to have been perceptive enough to identify the potential for a real contentious issue on the mundane question of how, no longer Arafat, but how Abu Mazen or the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians get from the Gaza Strip in any future arrangement and settlement from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank and back and forward. So there is this question of contiguity between the 2 wings. And there's also the question of contiguity, and that's how it's been used in a very restricted sense, the contiguity between the various Palestinian areas on the West Bank and the question of roads, closures, barriers, Israeli side roads, one Palestinian town separated from another, people separated from their places of work, all of these questions, the humanitarian issue, that the question of contiguity on the West Bank, so those 4 settlements to the north will be removed, Palestinian presence. There's still, it's like a checkerboard kind of arrangement just on the West Bank alone. All I'm asking in coming weeks and months as you follow the evolution of this slow, painstakingly slow process of inching towards peace, that you do be aware of the facts on the ground, that there is no clean cut, that there is no disengagement of Israelis from Palestinians.
Thank you for your remarks. I'm Jim Vittorello with the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace. We're a group of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian organizations here in the D.C. area and very involved in this issue. Several leading commentators, you might say, such as Jeff Aronson here at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the International Crisis Group, recently wrote about the future of concerning, and I think this woman mentioned earlier about what happens if Sharon stops at Gaza, which every single commentator I've read and Israel in here say he will do. He will stop at Gaza. Number two, he continues to encircle Jerusalem and make it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, they'll ever be in East, Jerusalem, capital for Palestine. And at the same time, the Israeli elections are not until the middle of next year. Now, meanwhile, the so-called ceasefire is due to end at the end of this year. Do you see that as a powder keg that is not going to wait until the elections of next year? What's going to happen in Israeli society, particularly with the Labour government, if they see Sharon digging in his heels? And let's assume that Abu Mazen does a good job in Gaza.
All right. I appreciate how you ended it, because that's an assumption. If Abu Mazen, there's always, as with Arafat, and with Sharon, to be even-handed, there's always the question of the desire, in other words, the intentions, and the capabilities. And that's always, those are the question marks. There are those who say one and not the other, neither of the two. You're assuming a great deal. And I, for one, of course, hope that this time the Palestinians do not miss an opportunity. And both of us have had more than our share of missed opportunities. It's not a monopoly, if I use the term with respect to the Palestinians. But I do genuinely believe that they missed an opportunity. Not a golden, not ideal, nothing near what they ideologically would have wanted, but I do think that they missed the opportunity in 2000 at Camp David II. And something that needs to be emphasized about Israel's presence in Israel's Israel.
I think he would beg to differ with you, but we'll talk about that later.
Israel's presence also. Time, there is nothing fault-free in the Arab-Israel conflict. You pay a price, and time is an ongoing factor. Time does not stand still, and so. Jerusalem, all of those issues. I'm not sure that it will be pressure from the Labour government, from the Labour component within the Sharon coalition government. Excuse me, but rather it will be, because this it's going to take time. I don't know how much time. No one is defining the incubation period or the testing period before one arrives at some basic conclusions about Abu Mazen, the Palestinian Authority, the structure, the security forces, and the ability to maintain responsibility for self-government and for security. In other words, there's going to be a lapse, it seems to me, before anyone really moves forward and presses for the next step. Yes, there will be international pressure, American statements as well, but I think it is legitimate. And Sharon is saying, all right, we've taken this major gamble, now we need to pause and see. And then there's the question of the sequence in the roadmap, the Palestinian preconditions that have to be met. This will be a source of wrangling, not just between Israel and the Palestinians, but with Washington and the UN and other factors as well.
Switch course just for a little bit and discuss regional events. In Iraq, for example, many in Israel argued, or many here in Washington argued, that the Iraq war would, by overthrowing and deposing Saddam, would make Israel safer. Now, some believe, and in the security establishment, they said that it was necessary to keep the Jordan corridor, the west portion of the West Bank, in order to deflect the threat from the east, from Iraq. Well, now that Saddam is no longer in power, what's the sense in the Israeli security sector today that with the developments in Iraq? Is it more problematic, more of a threat? Is this going to usher in a period in the long term where Israel can next remove itself from the West Bank Jordan corridor?
I think with respect to Iraq, I don't know how many of you are terribly complacent about the future prospects of Iraq. It's an open question. It's an unknown entity. I, for one, again, it's going to sound as though, but I despite the kippah and that, I like to be unorthodox in my political thinking, and out of the envelope, out of the box. And when the United States entered into Iraq, I said, from an Israeli standpoint, from an Israeli standpoint, and I'm a minority, it may be one, it's a no-win situation. If the United States succeeds beyond expectation, Israel is in and of the Middle East. We're there to stay. We are a player, a factor in Middle East affairs. We can't take any refuge anywhere. You know, in the clash of civilization, Samuel Huntington, in that eventuality, we're right there on the 50-yard line. We're right there in the middle. And therefore, in the first instance, if the United States succeeds admirably, that is, in terms of our neighbors, the Arab neighbors, that's yet another in the long litany of embarrassments, disgraces, exposing shortcomings, failures, that Iraq was not even able to defend itself, and Iraq isn't capable. Iraqis are capable of governing themselves. But on the other hand, at the other extreme, were the United States, and I speak as someone who very sensitive and involved in the U.S.-Israel relationship, that were the United States not to succeed in its multiple missions, not only stabilizing Iraq, apropos the recent headlines, but democratization and all the rest, that will be a major setback for the United States. And since the United States is one of the principal components in Israel's deterrent and strategic strategy, a setback for the United States would be a setback for Israel in terms of its credibility vis-a-vis the Arabs. So I don't take anything as final in Iraq. Were Iraq, another scenario people refuse to discuss. Were Iraqis refuse to be unification, and Iraq to break down, to be segmented and partitioned, then that too opens up an uncertainty on not only Israel's eastern border, but also Jordan's. And the Israel-Jordanian relationship, as we all know by now, is a very sensitive, very strong one. Two comparatively small, weak states in a tacit kind of mutual security regime. So as Clayton has read my chapter and quoted in this book on how Israeli-Palestinians negotiate, there I dwelt on the Israeli military and the security. They're always going to see, if one problem's solved, they're going to see that there's another threat looming just over the horizon. Maybe that's professionalism, maybe that's what they get paid for, is always thinking in terms of worst-case scenarios. And so therefore there still will be uncertainty on Israel's eastern border. And I end this response to that question. Please appreciate that the rationale for Israel's presence on the West Bank is not only the security argument, but it is also the national religious principle that there are two claimants to the disputed territory on the West Bank. There are two claimants. And as a student, I was asked to be a historian as a student of the long Palestine tragedy, the Arab-Israel conflict, however you word it, it reverberates, the words reverberate across the decades. The Peel Commission report of 1937, which already then perceptively defined the problem as a clash of right with right.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Go to this gentleman up here.
I just wanted, my name is Omar Al-Ghazi, I'm from the Middle East Institute, to talk more about the settlements. When you compared the different Israeli prime ministers and how they differed on certain topics, how do you see their differences and similarities regarding the building of settlements, and how would you relate that to the disengagement from Gaza?
Good. There are some nuances in the different governments and prime ministers. With varying degrees of enthusiasm or conviction, each of them started from the premise that, once again, I'm repeating myself, but that Israel and the Jewish people do have a claim. Whether it's asserted now or in the future, this is the pragmatism. Right? But, and secondly, all of them, for whatever domestic, political, coalition, or ideological reasons, yielded to pressures from the settler movement that politics, just like nature, abhors a vacuum, and that these territories which came into Israel's possession in 1967, that you just cannot leave them as just steady state, that life goes on, that there is a dynamic. The Gush Etzion bloc, here you then have to speak about particular ones. The Gush Etzion bloc, this was land which had been purchased by Zionists before 1947, 48. They were settlements which were in situ, which were there, flourishing. And then, as part of the 1948 fighting, Abdullah's Arab Legion took over the settlements. And so, immediately after 1967, children of those who had been the original settlers stepped forward, asking permission to be able to return home. Not new settlements, but rebuild. And so there you had the dynamic of the Gush Etzion bloc of settlements. So that all the prime ministers, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, lent their signature and their name to various building projects.
Final question, right here, if you can
I'll be very quick. This gets pretty direct, actually. There's been an effort. My name is Firas Lehman. I'm with the Middle East Institute. Thank you for coming to speak. Okay, my question is very direct. There's been an effort in the United Nations and in the international community to come to a consensus on the definition of terrorism. In your view, do you feel that Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation falls under the realm of international terrorism or terrorism? Thank you.
A direct question deserves a direct answer. There are certain means which are legitimate, and there are certain means which are illegitimate by any standard. And I will not accept any definition which says that terrorism of the sort which is intended to be indiscriminate rather than targeted. Had the Palestinians restricted themselves to soldiers in uniform, military, and I'm saying this painfully conscious of the fact, my own sons, that is one level, 1 degree of resistance. But to walk into a shopping market and to explode, detonate yourself, knowing in front of your eyes that there are grandmothers, mothers, baby carriages, I, as a Jew, as a human being, cannot contemplate it. And I cannot rationalize it. So I'm not making a blanket statement. My niece was killed. So you'll forgive me if I'm no longer wearing the hat of the academic. And I'm answering you directly. I will not tolerate that on the part of any Israeli Jew. It is a stain on Judaism. Baruch Goldstein in Hebron is unacceptable. There have to be certain rules of the game. I, personally, sensitive to the Palestinian, claim the right of right, a clash of right with right, and the need for us to coexist, feel that they missed an opportunity tactically. Sort of the passive resistance at the beginning of the 1987 Intifada, making an impact on Israeli public opinion. Those of us who are in the middle, those of us who are not true believers, but are desperately looking for some way of ending the vicious cycle. They would have picked up points, even with Israeli public.
I'll end as I began. Dr. Klieman, there's no doubt, as you've all seen, is one of those individuals capable of bridging the many differing emotional views of this conflict, as he just did. And I want to thank you again for coming. It was an excellent presentation, very sharp analysis. Thank you again, Dr. Klieman.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I hope so.
Hey, Bill, by the way, great.